Hello and welcome to the Open Era podcast. My name is Simon Bushell. I hope everyone enjoyed the WTA World Tour Finals and some of the shock results that we saw over the last weekend. We will certainly cover all of that absurdity next week, but this week, however, Devang is away for a very, very well-earned rest. He is, in all places, in Vancouver, British Columbia. Funny that. It's also quite funny that he made the trip while I wasn't there. I'm not taking it personally, I promise. With all that being said, I thought it would be fun to revisit an old episode that we did, which covered the now retired Roger Federer at the Tennis Masters Cup in 2004. As we arrive at the 2022 version of the year-end finals, it felt only fitting to go back to one from our vault and see how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. It's an unbelievable match. It's one of my favorite episodes, and I really, really hope you enjoy it. As a reminder, we are on Patreon at OpenEra, and you can also find us on Twitter. That's right. Twitter. Who doesn't want to be on Twitter in November 2022? If you're one of the still 8 people left on that platform, you can find us there, which is at OpenEraPod. Really, really hope you enjoy the episode, and we'll talk to you next week.
Hello and welcome to the Open Air Podcast. My name is Devang Desai and I'm joined, as always, by Mr. Simon Bushell. Bush, how goes it, sir?
It's going very well. My shoulder is extremely sore. I have got it back out on the tennis courts and I'm playing with an RF97 autograph. I've never played with a racket that heavy. For those of us who don't know, it's about a 400 gram racket. It's extraordinarily heavy. It's a challenge. It is a little unwieldy, so I'm still getting used to it.
But when you connect on that forehand, though, you feel a little like Fed, don't you?
The ball doesn't come back very often. That's the thing. When you're swinging like that heavy, it tends to not come back. It doesn't get returned too much.
I'm glad you mentioned your racket. I'm glad you mentioned Roger Federer because, Bush, it leads me to an easy segue into the match we look back on this week. Now, if I say to you Roger Federer and Federer-Safin, Bush, probably not picking the 2004 Masters Cup semifinal as the match to look back on. But we did for a bunch of reasons, and I think one of the big ones is 2004 as a whole for Roger Federer was truly ridiculous. I think he cemented himself as the best player in the world and was beginning to draw comparisons to some of the greats. Little did we know how prescient those people were when they were talking about Federer. But also, Bush, we wanted to talk about Federer-Safin and the enigma that he was, the player that he was, the absolute killer of a ball striker, but someone you couldn't get a good read on, and yet someone who could pull out performances like he did in 2000 at the US Open. But Bush, I guess I wanted to ask you, what is your first thing that comes to mind when you think about Federer-Safin?
Well, you mentioned the word enigma, and I think it's probably true. And you see a lot of comparisons actually made to someone like Nick Kyrgios today in terms of the game style, in terms of a big, strong ball striker and all the things that go with it. I think probably the overriding memory that I have of him is that final in 2000 at the US Open. And really, in a lot of ways, I won't say a wasted career, because anyone who wins 2 Grand Slams and gets to 2 Slam finals has an extraordinary career, no doubt about it. But I think we look at it and just think, there's this young kid who arrives on the scene in the late stage of 2000, and by goodness, he has the whole world at his feet. Everything necessary to be an all-time great in the tennis scene. So really amazing looking at that, and even looking at here at this match in 2004, still very, very young, only 24 years of age, Federer 23. Both, you would argue, almost at the peaks of their career.
I remember how jarring it was to watch Federer-Safin absolutely destroy Pete Sampras in that 2000 US Open final. I was watching with my dad, big Pete guy, not crying, but like I was wounded mentally by watching an unheralded 20-year-old kid take out an icon of the sport. And it was a destruction, really. So what a way to signal your intent. But you look at Murat's career. I mean, he turns pro in 97. By the year 2000, he is now number 1 in the world, and he would hold that for 9 weeks. Our intern Elias tells us that he was the tallest man to reach the number 1 ranking, which, you know, I guess when you think about it, that does make sense, right?
It does make sense, yeah. Yeah, he's a big, strong dude, isn't he? And there's not that many people who have held the number 1 ranking, certainly in the Open era. And it is for you Sporkle fans out there, for you people who love pop quizzes, it's if you can name all number ones in the Open era, there's a beer waiting for you at the next Open era Open tournament. So I'll put that request out to someone to see if they can do it off the top of their heads.
It's a good one. Just the Tennis Masters Cup ATP Finals origin story overall. This Tennis Masters Cup was held all over the place. And now what we know it as is the ATP Finals is held at the O2 in London. And it's really theatrical setting with cool lighting. And it makes it a really unique tournament. But beforehand, you had this tournament basically as like a traveling carnival. Where it's like, all right, we're going to be in Lisbon one year. We'll go to Sydney. We'll go to Shanghai. We'll go to Houston. And then we'll go back to Shanghai before they shut down the shenanigans.
Very strange tournament. And I remember Andre Agassi had a couple of choice things to say about it in Open as well, which is another thing that we could probably dig into at another time. But yeah, I think both of us, and I think tennis fans in general, if you're around our age, know it very primarily at this point for being in London and for being this really the fifth Grand Slam that it almost is at this point. It does have a lot of prestige about it since they revamped the tour in terms of ranking points associated with it, in terms of just the overall prestige which is associated with that event. But not back here in 2004. It's held in Houston. And honestly, from looking at this and the way that it's talked about, I don't think anyone really wants to be here.
Well, I mean, not to completely crap on the tournament, but I feel like the Shanghai edition really produced some classic matches. And I remember that Nalbandian Federer match from 2005, of course, which is a classic in which Fed lost, but it did need to move. I think it needed some sort of consistency and a destination to make it comparable to a major. Because I think the fact that you're returning to the same place helps add to the mystique of how much this means. But it's an interesting crew that makes up the final eight at this tournament, alongside Leighton Hewitt, Safin, Roger Federer, and Andy Roddick is Carlos Moya, Gaston Gaudio, Tim Henman, Guillermo Coria. Whoa, boy.
Tiger Tim. We all know my opinions on him as well, and the fact that you have an all-time great here in Tim Henman is it's a feast for everyone involved in the tennis world to have someone of that stature grace this tournament.
So that year, Fed beat Safin in the Australian Open final. Safin's run to the final in that tournament was hilarious. He beat like 40 Americans on the way to the final. Todd Martin in 5 sets, James Blake in 4 sets, Andy Roddick in 5 sets, Agassi in 5 sets. So when he gets to the final, he's a husk of a man ready for the final end by Fed, and he did it. Fed delivers. Fed beats Roddick at Wimbledon, but it's Gaston Gaudio who has the other slam at the French Open before Fed enters the US Open and collects it pretty easily. It's a remarkable 2004 for Roger Federer, really.
It's an amazing year. It's one of the all-time greats if you look back at it, and really one of the greatest performances of all time, you would argue, in a US Open final against Leighton Hewitt. I remember that one so distinctly. This was at the point that I was becoming a very big tennis fan back in 2004. Not least the fact that you had someone who was so much better than everyone else. I think there's a little bit of comparisons in some ways between, I would say, Roger Federer and Stephen Curry, just doing things on a basketball court that had never been seen before. And I think that's true of the way that Federer played as well. There's someone who is completely just amazing. I'm trying to come up with superlatives which don't, dribble into cliche, but through all the different areas, you had players who had made the style their own. And then you had this guy who came along who just did everything really well. And it was amazing to see.
All right, we were talking about this off air, but I feel like we know of Roger Federer as he is now as someone who has his back isn't always fully working for him, and someone who really has to pick his spots. And yes, he is still a top 3-4 player in the world, but it's much difficult these days. And you rewind to 2004 and you watch this guy move on the court, and the people watching it in real time have never seen something like this before. So as much as I loved watching the match itself, I love listening to the reactions to some of the moments that Fed produces, because it is genuinely someone seeing something for the first time. Like, that is the Fed experience in 2004.
No, and I think that's very true. And I think what comes after him in terms of, it's impossible to talk about Federer without talking about Nadal and Djokovic as well. And I think Federer paved the way in a lot of ways for some things that he made look extraordinary. Those two players stepped up and in some ways have overtaken him in some of the things that he's able to do. And that's really extraordinary in its own right. I think one of the big things about looking at this match and listening to it specifically is listening to the commentary team. And they've never seen anything like this. They just haven't. They're just completely and utterly bewildered by what they're witnessing on court and in their descriptions of points and the construction of points and some of the shots that are being hit. Some shots, I have to say, that are amazing. It's truly incredible. But you watch it then versus what you watch now, and I think we've become sort of accustomed to seeing levels of brilliance. But you look at it and you're like, all right, that's a pretty good passing shot. And they're arguing like it's, the greatest thing since.
My God. It's great. No, it's fair. It's fair. Just for some statistical info to back our claims, Fed won 91.6% of his service games in 04. He was winning 34.8% of first serve return points, and he achieved the same percentage in 2006. That is surpassed only by Novak Djokovic in 2011, who had a 35.7% win rate on first serve return points. We're talking about Novak Djokovic being the greatest returner of all time, and rightfully so, but that's how good Fed was on that side as well in 2004. Like, he was a better returner than Nadal, Hewitt, Agassi, like Curry or Djokovic with those numbers. And in those losses, he lost 6 times in 04. Henman in Rotterdam, Nadal in Miami, Albert Costa in Rome, Guga Kuerten, French Open, Dominic Herbati in Cincinnati, and Thomas Berdych at the Athens Olympics. Boy, oh boy, I think Bush, that Berdych loss to the Athens Olympics, that's the one. He should have had that one.
Almost certainly, and I think it probably still haunts him. There are a few losses in the Federer career that he talks about, and it sticks out to him. He does talk about that Berdych one a lot. And I think the one that also sticks out on that list is that Nadal match in Miami. Just the first meeting between the two of them, the fact that Nadal wins it, the fact that it's just so written in history at this point. It's very fun to watch both of them, very clean shaven and very young.
Nadal fresh out of a casting call for Pirates of the Caribbean, the prequel, like before anyone knew it was a thing. He already was geared up. Yeah. There's that great photo of them before that match as well in Miami, where both Fed and Rafa look so young. But it's a wild year for Fed. He loses the Olympics, but still, he absolutely crushes the competition. He's something like 500 points ahead of Andy Roddick in the rankings by the time we enter the Tennis Masters Cup. Like, it's an insane lead. He doesn't have to play for several weeks, and he'd still be up there. That's how dominant he was. But I feel like 2005 and 2006 were also incredible. Bush, he won 8 Grand Slams in that time. He lost in total 15 matches in 3 years. Like, this run is, it's buried a bit in time, because you're right. You talk Fed, you talk Nadal, you talk Djokovic, and you talk about what changed when Nadal came on the scene and what changed when Novak first entered, made headways, and then of course returned for good. Everything is different, but we talk about the great man Fed and what a player, what a legend he is. Just a dominant force in these 3 to 4 years that I had a fun time looking back on.
And I think we've done it's been a really fun task to go back and look at some of these matches and talk about some of the players that we've spoken of across this podcast series. And since we've looked back at all of these different events and these players, we've talked about people transcending eras, right? And people talking, and players who have had styles which have been ahead of their time. I think it's almost impossible to say that at this point in 2004, he's so far ahead of anyone else in terms of, you look at Leighton Hewitt, who is the previous version of this, right? Someone they'd never seen it before. The fact that someone could be a baseliner and win on a grass court and everything else. And then Roger Federer comes along and just completely annihilates Leighton Hewitt, makes him look like a child in some of these finals. And it's interesting, right? That it's that next step forward, and he really is the pioneer to push the game forward again at that point, which Nadal comes along and takes on, and then Djokovic takes on again. And I'm sure we'll have someone else who comes on very soon, in 20 years' time when all 3 of these guys finish playing. So it's going to be interesting to see who that player is.
It's a great point, and Carlos Moya makes a point during this broadcast saying, I don't see anyone challenging Roger in 1 year's time, because it's so hard to to be at that level, and we'll see if he can keep it up. And it is what prophetic words? So we'll see, because we sure damn did. The guy is still playing right now, some 16 years later. So that's the prelims. Now the match coming up right after the break. Welcome back to the Open Air Podcast. Bush, on the other side of the bracket, we had Lleyton Hewitt and Andy Roddick in the semifinals. There were some highlights of this match as we lead into it, but the combination of Andy and Lleyton Hewitt in 2004, I think Andy is slightly less annoying in the annoying scales, but it's close.
Oh God! I remember hating both of these players when I was younger, and there's some very unlikable players in this top 10, isn't there? There's not very. It makes it hard to be a fan of a lot of players inside of this top 10.
I'm confident I would have became a big Fed guy anyways, just because of the way he played, and I liked aesthetically to watch him. But I definitely helped that everyone else basically around at this time was not likable in the least. I did not want to cheer for them.
Definitely not the nicest people to cheer for. Lleyton Hewitt lets out an almighty, a godly scream and godly come on at the conclusion of this match. It's enough to make you want to punch him right there on the court. It really is.
We love when he brings out the Viper, his famous point-in snake celebration. I'm not sure if it is a Viper actually or whatnot, but we had that. But the main event was now set, and we'll let the ESPN crew intro us.
Roger Federer versus Federer-Safin, world's number 1 versus number 4, the second semi-final of the year-ending Masters Cup.
Game 7 Federer.
It's the fiery Russian against the Swiss genius. The winner is in the Tennis Masters Cup final tomorrow.
That's from 2004. And by listening to the music, you'd have no idea if that was 2004, 84, possibly. This is a Cold War beats in the back. But yes, you heard it right. That's Cliff Drysdale. We're back for our weekly session. He's joined by Mary Carrillo and Patrick McEnroe in the booth. But we don't get them the whole match because our friend Federer-Safin Videos over on YouTube was a saint and posted all of this match except the final tiebreak, which I found unique in strategy. And there's a comment he leaves, Bush, in his video where someone asks where the tiebreak is, and he's like, oh, you can find a great quality version somewhere else on YouTube. And that's it. He was at peace. I really like that.
Respect also to Federer-Safin Videos as a handle on YouTube. Let's talk about calling yourself what you are.
When you want to talk about monetizing and boosting those subs, you got to go wide with your reach and really blanket it. We begin the match. It's a quick start for Fed. He's up already. He's held serve start to begin the match, and now it's love 30, and we get our first moment of Federer brilliance.
No way.
Oh, sure.
Come on.
Oh, yeah.
Why not?
What would you do in that situation?
Oh, my goodness. Don't start this so early, Roger.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was really the only appropriate response to a perfectly placed approach shot from Safin.
The reactions are priceless. I love Mary Carrillo. I love PMAC. It's like people discovering like a lost treasure. When Fed's just doing the flick backhands that now we see every week from everyone, right? Like
yeah, and I think it's really remarkable watching it back in 2004 and just hearing the audible gasps from people who have never seen this kind of tennis before, and it's really cool to see actually at this period of time, because knowing what we know now and how just normalized this has become, it's very fun to see people just being so overwhelmed by what they're seeing on a tennis court. By the way, Cliff Drysdale again. You mentioned our weekly session with Cliff Drysdale. The black hair returns.
It looks less black.
Sharpie highlight.
So the other match we did was the Australian Open final, correct? So that would have been 12 months earlier. It looks less black in this clip. I'll be honest here.
less just for men, less use of the Sharpie to color in the in the hair. Just uncomfortably close to his fellow commentators. Again, the third time we've covered a Cliff Drysdale match. It's too close. It is too, and I know it's probably the COVID thing talking, right? Like, and we just...
It's true now, you know what?
Distance, social distancing. But also it's just too close. You know,
listen. There's some people like Marat-Safin videos who go out there and make it their mission to let the people know about the truth. And I don't see Cliff Drysdale too close on YouTube. I don't see that guy making videos, putting out those claims. So you got some work to do, Sai, but it's all right. That's how good Federer was at the beginning of the match. And I think Safin's a bit not surprised, but he's like, all right, it's going to be one of those days, because as we've mentioned, Federer at 2004 is on another planet in terms of playing, and they're showing all of the 7 other guys who are at this Masters Cup talking about Roger and talking about what makes him so good. And I think it's kind of funny to hear the resignation in their voice, because this is really the beginning of his reign. Like, he makes the breakthrough in 2003, but this is the first full year of Federer. And you get the sense that these guys who are the top pros know that it's Fed's tour for pretty much the next 3 years at least.
So talking about this video package specifically, I got a few points about it. Number one, the hair on Leighton Hewitt and Carlos Moya is just terrible, just awful. And this is someone who has had his fair share of long mullets in my life, in my youth, without realizing it.
I think you're being a little too harsh on Moya. I thought Carlos Moya looked good.
You like the full, wet, slicked back look that he had going on there.
Maybe he's out of the gym. Maybe he just had a hit, He's getting in his media session.
True. In his media session, straight out of the gym, in his full suit that he's wearing. It's very plausible. The other point I'll make this, Tim Henman is here. Tim Henman is 28 years of age. Tim Henman looks the same in 2004 as he does in 2020.
Tim Henman has extreme Tuck Everlasting energy where he has not aged after a certain point. It is wild. No, you're right. I'm like, what? Is this some sort of time warp? It's hilarious.
I once heard Tim Henman described as having the haircut of a Lego brick man. So
That's true.
If you imagine like that black stick hair that you put on a Lego character.
Have fun unseeing that, because it's true. The story checks out. Another fun subplot, Peter Lundgren is Marat-Safin's coach. He's with him and his crew in Houston, but of course he used to be Federer's coach, and he was Federer's coach when Roger broke through at Wimbledon. So you have that relationship, but in the early going, it is all Fed, and you get Safin reacting to some Federer shots with that classic smile and grin as he's looking at his coach being like, yeah, you know what this guy can do. He's pretty good.
Yeah, Federer wins the first 3 games and Safin wins 1 point during that period of time. It's about as good of a start as you'll see. No one in the world, regardless of peak form for Rafa Nadal, for Novak Djokovic, would have come close to touching Federer through those first 3 games.
Took about 2 minutes as well. And I'm all about pace of play, so I absolutely love that. But again, Roger Federer, you're talking about him career-wise, what is a common refrain? He's a very good front runner, and that's what he was in the first set. He held serve, got out of not dicey situations, but Marat was there. And I think you could see that there was going to be a pushback coming from the Russian, and it came in the second set, because even though Safin labors through his first service game, he gets through it. Fed misses a boatload of breakpoint opportunities. Another common thing that we say about Roger as the career goes on and the matches go on, but he did regret it here, because as soon as he squanders that chance, Marat breaks him. He's up 2-love. It's 3-love quickly, and Safin is going for the Fed backhand.
So there's a few things that need to be said about this match specifically. I think it's a fun one to go back and revisit. Number one, and you touched on Peter Lundgren. I don't know whether or not there was any animosity between these two, because there's a fair bit of, as we say in British English, there's a fair bit of niggle between the two of them. There's a little bit of anger on court. And it's something you don't really see a very angry match in so many ways, considering. And I wonder whether Lundgren is part of that in some ways.
Do you think there was anger between the players? Because I got that feeling, but I thought it was between maybe the boxes, even between Mirka and Peter, and in that sense.
It's very possible, isn't it? Peter Lundgren, by the way, here looking very, very close to a James Bond villain in terms of you get a lot of reaction shots of him stroking his goatee. He needs a white cat and he's very close to a James Bond villain. But you mentioned that squandering a break points. Federer has a very, very straightforward, just a beautiful construction of a point to set up a forehand volley at the net, which he blasts a good solid 12 or 13 feet over the baseline and lets out an almighty roar of no, something you don't see a whole lot. And the reverse camera of this is very funny when you see the slow motion replay of it and you can just see his reaction of him screaming at himself. It's very funny to watch him. But there's a lot of chippiness, I would say, in this match, and it makes a pretty entertaining second set.
It's fair, and I think the way they were speaking about each other at the time, I didn't sense the animosity, but those dynamics where it's former coach, former pupil versus someone that helped you achieve the ultimate success, there's got to be some raw feelings there. But Safin's response in the second set was comforting because everything about Marat Safin's game, Bush was built to beat someone like Roger Federer, even someone like Roger Federer who is playing at the height of his powers and just entering what would be an unprecedented run. That's how good Marat Safin was as a tennis player. It just, you didn't know if you were going to get it on a consistent basis, but he had the ability to turn it up to a level that few could match.
Yeah, he did. He's extraordinary in this match in stretches, I would say. He doesn't consistently put it together, but when it's all working, it's amazing to see someone of the height, 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", I don't know exactly how tall he is, but to play that jumping backhand, to have no feet on the ground and still generate the power that he does, it's really quite extraordinary. And just to be able to move the way that he does, it's really quite impressive. I think the other thing that's interesting, talking about the things that they say on court to each other, Safin talks to himself a lot and you see him screaming at himself. There's a backhand that Federer misses to Safin goes up 3-love. And you hear Federer on the broadcast say, "Oh, that's a great shot, Roger," in the most sarcastic way. And it's strange, right? Because you don't often hear top players through the microphones on the court. And it's funny that they say the same sort of things that we say on the court in a lot of ways, which is like, "Oh, great, good job, mate."
Way to go, dumbass.
No, it's true, right?
Yeah, no, it's true. 100%. Love the Mike's picking that kind of stuff up. And I think certain players, I feel like Andy Murray, especially in the early days, you heard basically everything he was saying to his box, etc. And a well-positioned mic can give you extreme insight. But again, this is not a fully formed Roger Federer yet. A guy who plays extremely well, but not maybe the finished product that we come to see wearing the sweater vest out at Wimbledon and dressing like a living god on the court at Monarch, which he basically became. But this is all Safin,
K-pop boy band.
Flash billionaire now as well, which, by the way, get those funds out of fossil fuels, Fed. We told you once. This is the last time.
We're warning you, man. We're warning you.
It's all Marat to begin the second set, but there's that underlying fear that if that level drops slightly, Federer is there to capitalize. But it's looking, Fed barely holds to keep it one break ahead from Marat, and he's down 2-4. That's where Safin kind of lets his focus slip. Is very bad in the service game that's upcoming. Broken. It's back on serve. Federer has comfortability that you saw in the first set, where even though he wasn't ahead, I think he was okay with the direction it was going, and it was obviously a tiebreak.
It was, and the thing that's interesting here watching these two play, Federer, I think the match is on Federer's racket, which is obviously true in 2004, just given the shot making that he has. I think it's probably reasonable to say that in a long rally, you kind of favor Safin, though. I think Safin's a little more solid from the back of the court, especially on the backhand side. I think Federer's still working through a few things, and he's still using that. I think it's a 90 square inch head on the racket. I don't think he's fully moved to the 95 or the 97 inch one at that point. So there are a few mishits. The ball striking is not as clean. If you watch him now, I think it's one of the things that doesn't get talked about so much. The man is an incredible baseliner. He can stand and rally forever, which is remarkable. You very rarely see him have a miss hit, which I think so many people criticize him throughout his career. Like, he shanks the ball all the time. He has miss hits. It doesn't happen anymore. I think he's worked so hard at that point in his game that the man is just simply a baseliner now who just happens to be a very aggressive baseliner. But with the greatest respect, I think Safin is very good at this point. I think he's a really, really solid ball striker who can stay in some of these long rallies.
And the backhand was a problem for Fed, and Safin knew it. And on the opposite side, Roger's forehand at this point might as well be classified as a weapon because it's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Safin does not want to go there. Got to go to the backhand. And it was working. It seemed to be okay, but Federer made that adjustment to recover. And in 2004, Roger was 20-5 in tiebreaks. And Safin was more 50-50, 24-26. So again, you're liking Roger's chances. But I'm going to be honest here, Bush, and I take your thought. This is the weirdest tiebreak I think I've ever seen in my life for multiple reasons. But two guys who are top players. Rogers would go on to become one of the GOATs. Safin is a multiple-time slam winner, but they could not string consecutive points together to save their lives, which made for comical and fascinating viewing.
It did. And we mentioned that little bit of animosity on court. Very tense. You could feel the tension in this tiebreak. Very, very tense. A lot of words being said. A lot of, by the way, in this match, horrendous. Just horrendous officiating all the way around. Terrible line calling. Technology has done a lot of terrible things to the world, but we will not say that Hawkeye has not had a good place in the world of tennis. There's a forehand that I'm sure we'll come on to in a second, but it's miles out, miles and miles out.
It's nervy. Federer is getting probably the advantage of some of these rallies, and Murat, when he's missing, is missing badly, causing him to launch a tennis ball into space after he just misses a passing shot. Ball's on Fed's racket. He's looking good. So an hour and 28 minutes in, first match point for Roger, and Murat Safin unloads a ridiculously massive backhand to save it. And it goes the other way. And that's what we see. It's Safin now with set point on Federer's serve. It's a bad Safin miss. You watch Murat Safin in this tiebreak, Bush. It's fantastic when he's defending against match points and absolutely terrible when he has a set point for himself.
It absolutely is. Nail on the head, honestly. And we talk about from just looking outright trash to looking like one of the greatest of all times. It really can be Murat Safin. I think in a lot of ways that it's the same thing that I talked about Kyrgios at the start. I think this is true of someone like Cilic as well. I think is a pretty good comparison for Murat Safin. And there's this tendency always to try and, find this soft middle with their game. It's like if we can just get them to rope them back a little and just, try and find a happy medium. And I think in some ways, I understand where that comes from. But there's the other side of it as well, which is like, this is just who they are. Like the guy is number 4 in the world for playing the way that he did. Leave him alone. Like that's just the reality.
Yeah, 100%. It's another match point for Roger at 10-9, and then we get the moment, Bush, that you alluded to, the call.
Oh, was it wide? I'm sure it was wide. Maybe it got a bit of a line. I don't think so. I think the match should be over. No wonder she's got her hand in front of her mouth. I'm sure that was wide. Yes, it was. It should be the match over. Wow. Down Steve Ulrich's land. Was it one to intervene? He's not a natural intervener.
Very difficult to overrule on match point. The linesman's got to make that call.
Incredible reaction from our commentators. Bush, Mirka's reaction was amazing. That's who Simon Reed was referring to. We switched broadcasts, left Murat Safin video for the official ATP channel account who has the Eurosport call, but Simon Reed is perplexed. He's stunned. It's way out. Steve Ulrich does not make the call. That's on the lines person, and that is fair, but absolutely shocking. The match is over. This should be over. And Federer, which I think is very interesting because there was always a discussion about Fed and nerves, maybe, and one you wouldn't think that would be necessary considering his CV and everything that he's won. But you look to that opportunity at Wimbledon against Novak a few years ago when he had 2 championship points and other opportunities where he failed to consolidate on match points. But at this point in 2004, that belief that he can beat anyone and there is no fear, he shakes this off so cleanly. It's ridiculous.
I think that's it's a good point. It's poignant that you bring up his discussion of nerves as well. It's something that I hadn't really thought about, and it's very true when you look at this match as well. And we tend to think these people are, gods, and they don't get nervous, and they don't have the mental jitters that so many of us do when we're playing at a club level tournament. So many of us have been through that. I'm putting myself very firmly in that bracket as well. But Federer's been very open about this, and I think it's one of those things that so many parts of masculinity you can have discussions of, and especially in the sporting world. But he's been very, very open about how he does get nervous and it affects his game. And I am glad that someone of his stature talks that way. I think it's very useful, and it is a good thing for society that someone has the guts to come out and say those things.
Match point number 5 for Roger. This time, Safin's shot is called out, overruled. It's in. Steve Ulrich redemption. He spares Safin, correctly so. The same linesperson botches the call. The commentators are now raving about Roger's class for not going ballistic on this linesperson. And to what extent, I don't know. I don't know what they expected him to do, but he didn't do that, and they loved him for it. They were super appreciative that he just took his lumps and kept going.
Steve Ulrich and the lines people here in full country club garb, fully in the outfit that you would expect to see in a country club. It's not great. It's full Lacoste.
It's bad. It's bad all around. I understand why Houston lost his tournament. I'm joking mostly, but it was a bad look all around, shocking. And again, Federer manages to recover, and we get another now moment of Federer brilliance.
Roger Federer, you are the man.
That was an amazing backhand. He was under so much pressure. Safin couldn't have played the point any better. The length on the forehand was supreme. He got set up, and perhaps the only thing he could have done was hit it slightly closer to the single sideline. But for Federer to be able to change direction on the ball there under that much pressure, unbelievable.
It's a ridiculous shot. Bush, a backhand that had been a problem for him, came up massive there, but it's a point, sorry, that I rewound several times and watched again, because to take the force that shot is coming at him with, that Safin delivers, and to direct it with placement like that, just ridiculous. And no matter how bad the calls may have been, and no matter if he should have been off court, Roger is showing now that extra level, that extra ability, and it's remarkable to watch, because I mentioned that Safin was bad on his own set points. Roger is not playing consistently well here at this moment. He's basically finding it every other point. So now you're basically at a stalemate.
So I think there's one thing that I always try and approach these podcasts and try and think of something interesting to say. I mean, our fans and our listeners can tell me whether or not I do a reasonable job of that. Because,
still waiting, dog.
Oftentimes, exactly, right? Yeah. One day I'll come up with something useful to say.
We're 42 episodes into this, man. When's this other shoe going to drop?
Exactly. So I was hitting the other day, and one thing that always really strikes me about when you go out and you watch players that are of a decent standard, someone who's a 4.5, a 5.0, and anything above, right? Even a college player, anyone who plays at a decent level. You see so many people striking the ball so cleanly. They're at the back of the court, they're rallying, they're finding a good length, both forehand and backhand. They go through the warm-up where they do your short warm-up, you do your volleys, your smashes, you hit a few nice serves, and then you put them in a match situation, and it just completely falls apart, and there's no creativity, and they just try and wait a minute, the ball's not coming exactly where I'm supposed to be striking it every time. I can't do it. And I think that's probably the best thing I can say about Roger Federer is that the way that he trains and how he continually tries to push himself in terms of trying ridiculous things, and even in training of being well, I wonder if I can do this. I wonder if I'm capable of doing this.
But remember he
works.
And it's not a trick shot if you practice it all the time. And I think that's something that he mentioned as well, right? It's only a trick shot if it's not something that you willfully trained for. It's a great point. It's exactly that, because I wonder how many times he's been in that position in training, and it obviously pays off there, but Safin responds, and it's a boxing match. It's going the full 12 rounds. We're now in a position that we had never been before in terms of state of the tournament in the semifinal and length of a tiebreak. In the past, first round matches had similar tiebreaks, but at this point in time in 2004, this is now the longest tiebreak. Well into the late teens. It's 18-18 now. A ridiculous double fault from Murat-Safin that needs to be chronicled just singularly in terms of how far it was out. The second serve was it might as well have been in Dallas when they were in Houston. That's how far out it was. He switched off, and it was a massive. You got to commend Murat-Safin for sticking around and really battling mentally. And this is a guy who managed to save, how many was it in the end? I think he saved 7 match points. He had 6 set points of his own that he couldn't capitalize on, but eventually it became too much and he couldn't do it. It was Rogers.
And Federer has another match point. It's match point number 8. Close, but the right call. No, way long, and Roger Federer has won the match twice. But in a way, the line judge and the umpire did us a favour, because we'd have been robbed of some terrific stuff 10 minutes after Federer won the match for the first time, so we won't carp too much, but just say what a wonderful human being he is, Roger Federer. Not just a great tennis player, but the way he knew that ball was out, the way he came back after that to beat a recharged Safin was outstanding.
I love it. That's just
get a room, guys.
Federer fully able to strangle Steve Elric if he wanted to. Did not. What a man. Simon Reed loves Roger. I'm honest, Bush, when I heard him speaking, I wondered if we sounded like that, and I had to do some self-reflection.
I thought the ring was coming out, and I thought there was going to be a proposal to the conclusion of this. Did you think that ball was long, by the way? Do you think Safin's forehand was long?
I thought it was closer than some of the other shots. Yeah, same. I couldn't trust these people after what I had seen over the last 2 hours. As I mentioned, since the tiebreaker was introduced in 1970, only 2 other matches had one that went 2018, but those were first round encounters. So stakes extremely high, a ridiculous tie rate. Roger comes out ahead. And of course, Roger, as he did on the usual during his days, absolutely blew the doors off Leighton Hewitt in the final. 6-3, 6-2, caps off 2004 with yet another title. 11 titles in 2004. And he was just getting started. We'll talk about the aftermath right after the break. Welcome back to the final segment of this Open Era podcast episode. Bush, we talked about what would happen after this a bit, but didn't see the result in that 2005 Australian Open semifinal coming, did you?
Certainly didn't. No, I remember that one very distinctly. I think this was probably the first Australian Open I properly did the full staying up for overnight. A little bit more different in the UK than on the West Coast here in Canada. So little better in terms of watching that Australian Open. It wasn't quite as bad as the pair of us got used to over the last 15 years, but a good one to watch and an amazing victory, actually, going back. Good match. And I think that's probably the one that really does stand out. If anyone was going to ask you the rivalry between, the quote unquote rivalry, if there is such a thing, by the way, between these two, it would be that semi-final in Australia.
Yeah, if someone were to ask me what Safin Fed match should I watch, it is that match. But I think you and I wanted to tackle this one for the reasons we stated at the top. And I think the end of 2004, entering 2005, the question is how high could Roger Federer go? And people knew that he would be a force for at least the next 3 years, as Carlos Moya indicated. But boy, 16 years later, And some 21 Grand Slams later, he did pretty well for himself. At Safin, it's a bit of a different story, Bush. You mentioned this a bit off the top, but I wonder, you got 2 slams, you made 3 semifinals at majors, you won a bunch of titles. But you have to wonder, all of that talent was something left on the table.
Almost certainly, I think. And I mentioned this, I can't remember when it was. We were talking about Juan Carlos Ferrero and his record since he won a Grand Slam, and just the overall sort of transition into effectively like a middle nothingness blob. And I think that the same is true. And I actually mean that with the greatest respect. I mean, they're Grand Slam champions, and to be a professional player on the tour is an incredible achievement. The same thing is true with someone like Leighton Hewitt as well, someone who reached the pinnacle of the sport, who was world number 1, a double Grand Slam champion, who then just kind of became a top 20 player, like a top 50 player. And that was just the extent of what they were. And you look at Safin's record post him winning in Australia in 2005. It's kind of a bit of nothingness, really, right? A couple of fourth rounds, gets that semi-final out of absolutely nowhere in 2008 in Wimbledon, which no one really expected. But other than that, kind of a bit of a shame considering what we thought he was going to be.
That 2008 Wimbledon run was nuts, because that really was out of nowhere. There was some Goran vibes I got from that run, eh?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a really good comparison. I think also the point that should be made about that Wimbledon run as well is Safin was on record as hating grass, loathing playing on grass, and describing it, I believe, at one point of saying that grass should only be there for a cow to eat, which is a great quote, by the way, in the tennis circles, and really would make the monocle drop in the All England club. I didn't realize that Novak Djokovic would take that so literally and start eating the grass on the court. But yes.
It's excellent. It all ties back to one. Roger and Safin met at 2007 Wimbledon in the 3rd round. Fed would win that. Safin's final career, 2009 at the Paris Masters, he would lose to Juan Martín del Potro, which is a very interesting passing of the torch, if you want to consider it that way, Bush.
Yeah, I think it is actually, right? And we mentioned these big, powerful hitters in terms of, we coined the phrase hashtag, big guy moves well. I think that's a pretty good comparison as well, isn't it? Another one in the long lineage of those people who are, big, large individuals, hit the ball really hard, but actually are quite graceful when they're moving around the tennis court.
It's fun to think about, because that's also Juan Martín is in the process of studying the tennis world and maybe adding it. It's a big 4, it's a big 5. Like, who knows how far Juan Martín can go, and maybe there are some parallels there as well for what could have been and maybe what Juan Martín was robbed of and what we missed out on is watching due to injuries. Marat Safin would become a member of the State Duma, representing the United Russian Party. He's a politician. He gets into the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 2016, becoming the first Russian player to get in. You see him every now and then now around the tour. He's involved with the Russian players. A very good crop of male players now to match how good they've been on the women's side for many years. Marat Safin, I love seeing around the game. It's a funny guy. It's also someone that I feel like I'm confident thinking that he's having a good time with things. There's no way for me to totally know that, but just by looking at him, he looks like he's having a time.
All right. Okay.
That
seems reasonable.
That's the insight you expect out of me. And we mentioned that Safin has lived many lives since tennis, and he's a politician, he's a coach, he's in the Hall of Fame. He's still playing. He's still playing right now, and he might add another slam to that total, and it's all pretty ridiculous when you think about it. But at this moment in time in 2004, I think you're ready to see Federer really, really just take over. And it's awesome to watch. And there's so many things about Roger's game that you appreciate more when you're able to step back a bit.
Totally, yeah. And I think there are years in the careers of the big 3 that you can look at and just be utterly astonished by how dominant they were. I think those 3 years that we talked about, 4, 5, and 6 for Federer, are one of those. Djokovic has at least 3 where he's also fully gone on runs where it's astonishing, and Nadal seems to do it every year. He seems to be never quite as dominant in a single year, but just continually brilliant over the entirety of his career. So amazing looking at that period of time. And just, I mentioned at the start of the podcast of him basically being a pioneer for these other 2 guys coming along who are just so great in their own right and just pushing the game to another level. And I think both of them have spoken about that, of watching Federer and the height that he got to and the ability that he had and forcing everyone else around him to raise their game.
Would be pretty fun to see 2011 Novak versus 2005 Roger, eh? Boy, oh boy.
One of the greatest things you could say about Novak Djokovic is an incredible mover, and I don't think we touched upon it in this one enough, is that how good Federer's movement was back in 2004. He's so fast. He's unbelievably fast around the baseline. And there's a point, which is right at the end before we get to Safin double faulting at 18-17, where Safin, huge kick serve out on the ad side. Federer, awesome backhand chipped. Massive forehand into the other side of the court, into the deuce side. Federer tracks it down all the way across the court, full stretch, doesn't quite make it, but it shows the athleticism of someone who we don't really associate it, right, with in a lot of ways. We think, he's just a fun-loving guy, very, very fit in a lot of ways, but not a quality all-time great athlete. And you look here in 2004, and he's phenomenal.
It's truly remarkable. That was the Tennis Masters Cup semi-final from the 2004 edition, won by Roger Federer in straight sets, but including a historically long tiebreaker. Bush, anything else to add before we take off?
Don't think so. Enjoyed that one. We'll always enjoy going back and watching 2004 Roger Federer.
It's a simpler time, as we thought he'll never age and he'll be that same way forever. And things changed, obviously, but he was pretty darn consistent throughout. I think I asked for consistency sometimes in a turbulent world, and Roger Federer usually delivered, and I'll always thank him for that. Thank you to Dylan Wilson, our producer extraordinaire, for his aid on the ones and twos. You can find us on Twitter at OpenEraPod. We are at Patreon, patreon.com/OpenEra. Your support is much appreciated. A rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast would be a big help to us as well. And that's it for this week. We'll talk to you soon.